Hello everyone and welcome to the lesson about evolution and focusing on natural selection, which was the theory proposed by Charles Darwin. Today we're starting with Charles Darwin and his theory, but as we go through this unit we're going to be looking at the history of the earth and how we evolved from anaerobic bacteria that didn't use oxygen to plants, mammals, and birds, and the history of the earth, of how it's thought that we got to this point in the history of the earth. The first theory of evolution was was developed by a guy named Lamarck. And Lamarck's idea was that over time, organisms acquired traits that they needed throughout their lifetime and then pass them on to their offspring. The classic example of this is using giraffes. And what Lamarck thought is that as trees grew taller, the living giraffes had their necks grow larger because they needed them to be able to reach the food. And what he thought was that organism, the one living, grew its neck larger and then passed that trait onto its offspring. He also believed that organs or parts of the body that were not used would disappear in the organism and therefore not be passed down to the next generation. So essentially, Lamarck thought that an organism needed a trait in its lifetime, developed it while it's living, and passed it on to its offspring. We obviously know that that is false. You could not just grow taller because all the apples are on top of the tree and then pass that trait on to your offspring. Next came Charles Darwin, and Charles Darwin was born in England, and he proposed his theory of natural selection. And he traveled to the islands in the Galapagos Islands to study animals that live there, and we're going to take a look at the animals that he studied and what he postulated based on his study of those animals. So, one of the classic Jeopardy questions is, what boat did Charles Darwin use to travel to the Galapagos? And the name of the boat, not that you need to know this, is the MHS Beagle. And he traveled mostly to islands on the South American coastline to study the organisms on those islands. Particularly, he stopped at the Galapagos Islands, which is off the coast of Ecuador. Now, what did he see on the Galapagos Islands? So, on the Galapagos Islands, something that's important about the Galapagos Islands, it's many islands separated by water. I don't know the exact number of islands, but there are many islands with a geographical barrier because they're separated by water. And what he noticed is that when he looked at the islands, that there were many different birds on the island, and depending upon what island that they were on, their traits were different. What he found, so many different types of bird he found, but these were all finches. And amazingly enough, there was only one type of finch on the mainland in South America. But on these islands, he found 14 different, trait-wise, they looked completely different, but they were finches. But they had different unique traits that made them different from each other. But they were all finches. So the question that Darwin was left pondering is, how did we go from one species on the mainland and get all these different species of finch on these islands? What he noted is that the traits that the organism had, or the finches had, correlated to the food source on the island. And he noticed that he grouped the finches into three main categories: seed eaters, flower eaters, and insect eaters. And what he noticed is that the beak of the finches was adapted to the food source that it needed to eat. So, for example, the flower eaters, who need to get their beaks into flowers to get the nectar, had longer beaks, long sort of thin beaks. Whereas the seed eaters had sharper, pointier beaks, so that they could open up seeds. But what he noticed is that the beaks of the finches correlated, or their characteristics correlated with what food source was available on the island. This idea, and we'll get much used to these terms, is called adaptive radiation. And adaptive radiation is when there's some change, environmental change usually, that causes rapid evolution, because the organisms have to either adapt to that change, or, if not possible, die. So adaptive radiation is the process by which organisms rapidly evolve, their traits change over time, due to a change in the environment, usually. Now, the differences seen in the beaks, obviously, as we said before, were associated with the available foods on the islands. Having the correct beak allowed that could successfully eat the food, allowed those finches to survive, and therefore reproduce. Those finches that did not have beaks that were adapted to eat the food source were not able to eat, therefore were not able to survive, and therefore were not able to reproduce and pass the trait of their beak on to their offspring. Ultimately, Darwin concluded that there was variation that existed in the beaks on the island, and that over many generations, only those organisms that were adapted to survive on that population were able to reproduce. So gradually over time, all the birds on the island had the beak that was adapted to more successfully eat the food. Those variations in the population that didn't have successful beaks that were able to eat the food eventually completely died out. And those with the beaks that could eat the food, that had the traits that were necessary to get into the seed or get into a flower, were able to eat, survive, and reproduce. And then eventually over time, only the advantageous traits stayed in the population. Those that were not advantageous died out. Another word, advantageous, added to the list, added to the list, Hunter, added to the list. So, in summary, differences in beaks allowed those that had the better beaks to compete or outcompete those that didn't have beaks that were advantageous to get food. And as a result, those that had the beneficial beaks were able to feed more often or eat better. And those that were able to eat more often were able to reproduce more successfully. And then eventually those that could not eat died out. And that led eventually to all the birds on individual islands having the beak, and only the beak, that was adapted, I guess we'll say in this case, to eat the food. Those that didn't have beaks that were good, died out eventually. And that beak was no longer seen on that island that had that food source. If you look over here, you can sort of see, I don't really care that much about birds' beaks, but you can see sort of the shape of the beak, and then they tell you sort of how that beak was adapted to eat the food source on the island. If you look at the large-bellied finch, large-billed finch, it has a larger beak, right, that it's allowed to be able to crush large seeds. Where if you had a beak that was small, like, the poor little warbler finch, he wouldn't be able to eat those large, hard seeds. He wouldn't be able to crush them, and then he wouldn't be able to eat, and then he would die off if he was on the island that had only large, hard seeds to eat. So he also made similar observations on the island with turtles, and he noticed that the length of the turtle's neck also correlated with the food sources available on the island. If the food sources are available low, in the grass and things like that, he noticed that the tortoises on that island had short necks. And then if the food source was located higher up, he noticed that the tortoises had longer necks. And that makes sense, because if you have a tortoise with a short neck, the turtles can't jump. The turtle would be unable, with a short neck, would be unable to reach the food, therefore be unable to eat, unable to survive, and unable to reproduce. So then eventually on that island, what he noticed is that only turtles with long necks existed. Just taking a side note, as humans, we engage in sort of natural selection itself, but artificially. Especially in plants, A lot of times we will mate plants to get certain traits that we want. We pick plants that we like, that grow the correct food, the sweetness of the food, and we mate plants together to get the traits that we want. This was done often to get different species of vegetables, so it's true that Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, and all these vegetables here evolved from the same species, and we did that by mating different types of plants that had the traits that we want continuously to get plants that had the traits that, as humans, we wanted to eat. This is also sort of done artificial selection. We do this when we mate, or dogs per se. We want dogs with certain traits. So we select the dogs that we want to mate based on the traits that they have. And by the way, almost forced selection, because we're forcefully mating the dogs that have the traits that we want, so those can be passed on to their offspring. But artificial selection is instead of the environment selecting for the organisms that get to mate, we as humans pick the organisms. So we're artificially selecting by taking the organisms together and trying to get them to mate, instead of the environment saying, these are the organisms, well, not that the environment says, the environment selecting for the organisms that are able to mate by those that are not able to survive in the environment, dying off or not being able to reproduce. But artificial selection is the idea that we as humans are selecting the organisms to mate, as opposed to the environment selecting for them. So after Darwin did his studies on the Galapagos Islands, he wrote a paper on it. It was called The Origin of the Species, and he was reluctant to publish because the Catholic Church at that point was sort of excommunicating people for not believing. This was not in line with the teachings of the Catholic Church. And he actually didn't publish his work until he died. His wife published it for him. It was definitely controversial at the time. But his book proposed 5 main ideas, and these are really, really important ideas about how organisms evolved, or how organisms got traits that were adapted to the environment. The first part of his theory was that variation naturally exists in populations. The second part, and this is not always necessary actually for evolution, but this was part of his theory, is that for whatever reason there's overproduction of offspring. More offspring are produced that can survive in the environment. Then, and let me just load all of them. Because there's more offspring that can survive in the environment, there's competition between those organisms for food, shelter, mating to mate, or there's competition from predators. And what happens is that those that have the traits that are most able to win those competitions are able to survive. Those that don't have the traits to get the food, or to find mates, or to escape predators will eventually die off, and as a result, only those that have the traits will survive, that are good, and only those that have those traits will be able to reproduce, and then obviously if you reproduce, those traits are passed on to offspring, whereas those that weren't able to survive in the environment, they don't get to pass on their traits, and eventually those traits are no longer in the population, or are in the population at a much decreased amount. These 5 postulates are extremely important for you to remember and apply to various populations. They're really extremely important to memorize. Another thing that's important is sort of the difference between Lamarck and Darwin. Never say, the AP exam will tell you, that organisms evolve because they need the traits. Organisms evolve because the traits exist already in the environment due to variation. And as a result, those that have the traits that are most beneficial to the environment will outcompete, outsurvive, and outproduce those that do not have, outreproduce those that do not have the traits that are beneficial to the environment. As a result, many of the traits that are beneficial to the environment will get passed on to offspring, where those that are not will not. Time is going to round out, and I have one more slide, but I need to do another video, so load the other video. I'll see you in a couple seconds.